Part 1. The Verdict on Cold Stone. On June 22, 1633, inside the monastery of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, a 69-year-old man-frail, half-blind, and trembling knelt on the cold stone floor. This was Galileo Galilei, court mathematician to Florence, and once celebrated as the most brilliant mind in all of Europe. Before him sat not eager scholars gathered for a scientific lecture, but 10 red-robed cardinals of the Vatican Inquisition, staring down with stern, expressionless eyes. With his hand placed upon an open Bible, Galileo was forced to recite a pre-written recantation, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies, that the sun is the center of the world, and that the earth moves. This was no ordinary academic debate. It was a public ritual designed to break the spirit of a genius. History often frames this moment as a simple story. Progressive science clashing with religious dogma, the light of reason battling the dark of the Middle Ages. But viewing it so narrowly misses the ruthless political maneuverings, institutional panic, and profound personal tragedy beneath the surface. The trial of Galileo did not begin with the stars. It began with power struggles, a terrified church, and a great friendship twisted into bitter hatred. How did a scientist once welcomed by the Pope as a hero end up under house arrest? Until his dying day. Why did a church that patronized the arts and higher learning decide to crush one of its greatest intellectuals? To understand, we must step back to the year 1609, when Galileo first pointed a crude spyglass toward the night sky. For what Galileo saw through that lens was not just planets, but the impending collapse of a world order that had stood for millennia. Part 2. The Lens That Defied God. In the early 17th century, humanity's view of the universe was orderly and comforting. Earth sat stationary at the center of creation, surrounded by heavenly bodies moving in perfect circles. Ptolemy's geocentric model was more than physical theory. It was a pillar of Catholic theology, placing mankind at the heart of God's grand design. Everything changed when Galileo, a constantly broke mathematics professor in Padua, refined a Dutch spyglass into a telescope capable of 30x magnification. The first night he aimed his lens at the moon, Galileo expected the smooth, flawless pearl described in Scripture. Instead, he saw a rugged surface scarred with craters and jagged mountains. The moon was just as imperfect and barren as the Earth. The following night, he turned his telescope toward Jupiter and discovered 4 tiny bodies orbiting the gas giant. This was a fatal blow to the old world order. If Jupiter had moons orbiting it, then not everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. Galileo did not keep his findings hidden. He published his masterwork, Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in Latin, instantly becoming an intellectual sensation. In 1611, he traveled to Rome, where Jesuit scholars confirmed his observations through their own telescopes. At that moment, the Catholic Church did not hate Galileo. They toasted him, feted him, and claimed him as a shining emblem of Catholic intellectualism. But Galileo refused to stop at describing what he saw. He insisted on asserting what it meant. He publicly championed Nicolaus Copernicus's heliocentric theory. The sun sat at the center, and Earth was merely another planet hurtling through space. This was a dangerous leap, for if the Earth moved, the biblical account of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still in the sky would be reduced to mere myth. Recognizing the threat, the Inquisition issued a decree in 1616 declaring heliocentrism foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. Cardinal Bellarmine, the Vatican's top theologian, privately summoned Galileo to issue a historic warning. Galileo was permitted to discuss Copernican theory as a mathematical hypothesis, but was strictly forbidden from holding or defending it as physical truth. Galileo acquiesced. Part 3. Friendship and Feathered Hubris. For 7 long years, Galileo remained quiet, though the fires of ambition burned undiminished within him. Then, in 1623, fortune seemed to smile upon him. Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a close friend and admirer of Galileo's genius was elected Pope Urban VIII. Barberini was sophisticated, a lover of poetry, a patron of the arts, and an intellectual heavyweight. He granted Galileo 6 private audiences, showered him with lavish gifts, and gave him permission to write a new book comparing cosmological systems. Pope Urban VIII attached only one condition: the book must present both views, geocentric and heliocentric, equally, concluding that God's power is infinite and beyond human reason to measure. Galileo returned to Florence and spent 6 years crafting his magnum opus, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Here lies the tragic turning point. Galileo was no humble, quiet scholar. He was arrogant, possessing a pen dipped in razor-sharp satire. Instead of composing a dry Latin treatise, he wrote in vernacular Italian so that any literate citizen could read it. He structured the book as a 4-day debate among 3 characters: Salviati speaking for Galileo, Sagredo an intelligent neutral party, and Simplicio defending the Church's geocentric model. The name Simplicio carried a double meaning. While named after an ancient philosopher, in Italian it translates directly to simpleton or fool. Throughout the text, Salviati uses razor-sharp scientific logic to dismantle Simplicio's arguments, reducing him to a bumbling clown. Worse still, on the book's final page, Galileo placed the exact words cautioned by Pope Urban VIII straight into the mouth of Simplicio. When published in 1632, the book sent shockwaves across European intellectual circles. Readers openly mocked the Church's stance and correctly deduced that the Pope was the simpleton. Galileo's hubris had crossed from scientific debate into a direct insult to the ego of the most powerful man in Christendom. Pope Urban VIII felt deeply betrayed by the friend he had once sheltered. This personal rage collided with a brutal political backdrop. The 30 Years' War was ravaging Europe. Accused by rivals of being soft on Protestant heresy, Pope Urban VIII desperately needed a high-profile target to demonstrate his absolute authority. And Galileo, the arrogant philosopher from Florence, had walked straight into the crosshairs. Part 4. The Trial and the Breaking of a Man. In September 1632, an Inquisition summons arrived in Florence, elderly and ailing. Galileo pleaded for a delay, but the Vatican responded brutally: travel to Rome willingly, or be brought in chains. The brutal winter journey drained Galileo's remaining strength. He arrived in Rome in February 1633 and was placed under house arrest at the Florentine embassy. During months of interrogation, the prosecutors paid little attention to whether the earth actually moved. Instead, they zeroed in on a single legal question: had Galileo violated Cardinal Bellarmine's 1616 injuncti? Galileo tried to argue that his book did not endorse heliocentrism, but merely weighed it as a possibility. But the judges held up the text, the satirical tone, Salviati's dominance, and the name Simplicio condemned him. On June 21st, the court subjected Galileo to Territio Realis, taking him into dark subterranean dungeons to inspect blood-stained instruments of torture. They did not need to rack his limbs or crush his fingers. The sight of iron chains and open flames was enough to break a sick 69-year-old man. Galileo's psychological defenses crumbled. He realized no miracle was coming from his former friend, the Pope, nor would any scholar rise to save him. He understood that remaining stubborn meant ending his life on a burning stake, just as Giordano Bruno had 33 years earlier. On June 22nd, dressed in the white robes of a penitent, Galileo knelt and recited the betrayal of his own intellectual child. Popular folklore claims that as he rose, Galileo stomped his foot and whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet, it moves. Modern historians agree this never happened inside the Inquisition chambers. Galileo was a broken, exhausted man who wanted only to survive and return home. The Inquisition handed down its sentence. The dialogue was placed on the index of prohibited books, and Galileo was sentenced to life imprisonment. Pope Urban VIII later commuted the sentence to permanent house arrest at Galileo's villa in Arcetri, near Florence. He was forbidden from receiving unapproved guests, teaching, or publishing any future works. The man who had peered further into the cosmos than anyone in history was now confined to a small estate, monitored by monks. Tragically, just months after his return to Arcetri, his beloved daughter Sister Maria Celeste, the only person who truly understood and cared for him, died suddenly at age 33. Part 5. Light in the Darkness and the Unyielding Legacy. Deprived of his daughter, abandoned by the church, and physically broken, most men would have given up on life. Yet in the dark isolation of his confinement, Galileo's brilliance flared once more. He returned to his first true love, physics and mechanics subjects untainted by theological heresy. In 1638, completely blind from staring at the sun through his early telescopes, he completed his ultimate masterpiece, To New Sciences. The text summarized a lifetime of research on motion, acceleration, material strength, and the experimental method. Unable to publish in Italy, the manuscript was smuggled across the border and printed in Holland, a Protestant nation, beyond the Inquisition's grip. This book provided the foundational cornerstone upon which Sir Isaac Newton would build classical physics decades later. Galileo Galilei drew his final breath on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. Pope Urban VIII prohibited his family from holding a public funeral or erecting a monument in his honor at the Basilica of Santa Croce. But while the Vatican won a minor battle, it lost the war entirely. The verdict against Galileo could not stop the Earth from orbiting the Sun, nor could it halt the unstoppable march of the scientific revolution. By persecuting Galileo, the Church forfeited its role as the intellectual center of Europe, driving scientific leadership northwards. It took 182 years, until 1835, for the Catholic Church to remove Galileo's works from the Index of Forbidden Books, and it took 359 years until 1992 for Pope John Paul II to formally issue a papal apology, acknowledging the Church's error in condemning Galileo. Looking back at Galileo's trial, we do not see a fairy tale where good instantly triumphs over evil. We see a sobering cautionary tale of what happens when political power and religious dogma try to bend objective reality to their will. Galileo was no flawless saint. He was proud, combative, and often politically reckless. But his legacy rests not on his temperament, but on an unalterable principle. Truth does not yield to power, belief, or human emotion. You can threaten, imprison, or burn those who speak the truth, but reality remains intact, silent and steadfast. Because in the end, despite all the dogmas and inquisitions, the earth still moves.